Welcome, welcome, welcome to my little corner of the world, TFTC, with yours truly. I really am very happy that you're joining me. Guess what? This is Thanksgiving week, Thanksgiving 2024, as I record this intro. Get ready. This is going to be a really fun Thanksgiving for many of you, I'm sure. So, and quite interesting. So, not going to really get into the nitty-gritty of that. I hope you all have a great time with your families this week. And speaking of families, this is a great week for this. I speak with author Jonathan Lerner, who delves very deeply into his family and his life. And he's done this in other books, but he came out with a new book this year in 2024 named Performance Anxiety. And he goes into a certain section in his life, probably one of the most tough sections of any of our lives. That's adolescence. But his being a baby boomer, it's incredibly interesting. The stuff that he has gone through and the self-discovery are just truly amazing. It's a great book. Get Performance Anxiety wherever you get it. I have a great talk with Jonathan. It is just delightful to hear how he has just lived many, many lives and very exciting. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you on the other side of this. Good morning. Great to see you. And just dive right into this thing. The new book is called Performance Anxiety. Now, what number book is this for you?
It is the sixth book or the fifth book, depending on how you count, because one of
Oh,
them was a collaborative project with some other writers.
yeah.
It's my second memoir, and I've also written three novels.
Yeah, you can't just do the memoir in just one sitting. Obviously, life's not over yet. You still have more chapters to write. So it's interesting how you are breaking this up. And with performance anxiety, this is an examination of a certain period and kind of jumping around too and analyzing how things had happened. Wonderful book, great read. And not like too heavy where it's going to take you a month to go through. So it's really, really well written in that regard as well.
Thank you. It isn't linear, that's true. It's kind of framed in my senior year of high school, but it's really about my whole childhood up until the time I left school to go to college. And so there's a lot of backstory and family background and focusing on different periods of my youth.
Did you really have to like go back into like your family tree and do all kinds of research that way, or it seems like you were jogging your memory quite a bit, going starting with your parents and then going to your grandparents?
Um, I used a lot of memory aids like photographs, letters, talking to my siblings, talking to old high school friends, or and discovering to my chagrin that several of them had died just before I tried to. I mean, we're of a certain age now. Um, but yeah, I have vivid memories, but I needed to sort of fill them out and jog them. And interestingly, one of the things I learned in this process is that memory is very fungible. It's not a fixed thing. Even in the course of the book, there are several memories that I correct. Like a little later, I say, wait, that's not how it happened. My younger brother, who just read the book, called me yesterday. We were talking about it, and he has like there's a very pivotal scene, which is the day my mother died. I was 16, he was 12. Um, I wrote it one way in the book, and then a little later, I said, wait, it wasn't exactly like that, and I corrected it. And he has still a different perception of it, but of course, we're two different people, and no people have the same experience will remember it exactly the same way.
Yeah, it seemed like it was very clear when you had to tell Higgy, is that the brother you were referring to, the younger brother, when you had to tell him that your mom had just
Yeah,
passed. Yeah, yeah, that's so. I mean, it seems like that was pretty sharp and vivid as you remembered it, as she was, going down, and then all the changes that were happening thereafter.
yeah. Well, it's a process of excavation, and that's when my first memoir that I wrote, 6 or 8 years ago, um, Swords in the Hands of Children, which is about a later period in my life after I dropped out of college and I was very involved in the New Left and the militant organization, the Weather Underground. Um, I what I learned writing that book was that every story is unique, and one person's story can illuminate a time and a place. Two people who were in the same place at the same time will have different ways of remembering it. But I realized that there's because you can use your own history to illuminate what was happening around you and in the larger like world, in the culture, in the politics. There's a value to others in writing memoir, and also I really enjoyed the process. To my surprise, I had a lot of fun writing that book, and then I thought, well, I finished that book. I enjoyed it. Along came the pandemic. I didn't have anything else to do. I thought, oh, maybe I'll write another memoir. I had so much fun doing the first one, so that's where this one came from. Um, you could call this one the prequel to the other one.
Yeah.
In a way, I mean, it shows how I was formed as a kid, and then the other one shows how I acted out or acted on that formation as a young adult. I don't know if there'll be any more memoirs. It's a long process too. It's kind of exhausting, but it is fun. I liked it.
It is, and it seems like a form of therapy too. Like looking back on it, you've stepped away
Yeah,
from a lot of things in life. Then you're looking back like, huh, maybe that one was gay. I'm not sure. I mean, just like, you were talking about a teacher who you really
yeah,
seem to admire. Well, maybe
yeah,
he had like what was going on there.
yeah. Well, that's it. There's no way to really know. I mean, especially, I mean, if I could, for example, have talked to that teacher, he's probably not alive now. He was 25 years older than me, and I'm 76. Um, I might have been able to find out the things I wonder about him. Um, but yeah, it's a process of excavation, basically. It's like being an archaeologist.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you find these artifacts, and you sometimes, as with archaeology, sometimes you find an artifact and you know this is an ancient artifact, but you don't know what it is, or you don't know where the other missing pieces of it are. It's a piece of ceramics that you can see it fit together with something else. Where's the rest of it? What was the rest of it? Um, so in that way, it's a little bit like writing fiction because in order to make a good story that people want to read, you have to kind of round it out and fill it in. And so you have to make a lot of choices in what you select in and what you select out. Um, so I realized this now that I'm doing a lot of work to try and promote the book because these days, unless you're a very rare, very well published and famous author, you do it all yourself. Even if you have a nice publisher who's put the book out in print, you still have to do all the PR. Um, I realized that to do the publicity, I'm kind of creating a character named Jonathan Lerner, who's like me, and everything about him is true of me, but everything about me is not true of him. And then I realized that's the same thing in the book. I've created a character who has my story, um, but he isn't exactly me because he has only the parts of my story that made sense to me to put in the book, that made it flow well, or that led one thing to another, or that rounded out certain things that I wanted to emphasize, and then avoided some things maybe that I really didn't want to emphasize.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see the descriptions that you use in the book when you're talking about Mr. Lewis and the car he drives and what he wore. It's like did that just come back to you and you were like, wow, yeah, I visually remember him having that style back then and then remembering the colors green and yellow and you were very innocent about those colors, but like,
Yeah.
oh, there was some symbolism there as well.
Yeah, I found out if you wore green and yellow in junior high school on Thursday, it immediately meant you were a homo. And I was a homo. I am a homo, but I was definitely fighting it at the age of 13 and 12. Um, and that was a time when you didn't own it. Kids today I think it's hard for them still, but they have the opportunity and the space to declare who they are. Um, uh, you know, uh, my visual memory is very vivid. Like Mr. Lewis, the ninth grade English teacher who you were referring to, absolutely, I can see him driving up to the school in his red MG Roadster, and then 2 years later, when he traded it in on a red Thunderbird convertible, I can see him driving that. I can see what he wore, Weegian loafers. I remember how he looks. I only have one photograph of him actually, and he's sort of leaning down like this. It's not even a good picture of him. Um, so I have a vivid visual memory for cars, for architecture, and those are both of those things are topics that I talk about a lot. I mean, I loved cars when I was a kid. I don't know anything about them mechanically, but I just loved the style of them. And in the 50s and 60s, they were wild, tail fins and chrome and changing every single year. Um, and the same with sort of architecture. I've always been interested in it. I don't really know why I got that interest, but my family lived in three different houses while I was growing up, each one of very different style. My friends lived in houses of different kinds of styles, and I have very like almost photographic memories of the buildings, the school buildings I was in, which and I describe those. I feel like that's, I could have written this story all about psychology and how I was feeling, but I don't think that makes a very vivid story. I mean, if you're reading something, you want to be able to picture it. So hence the
Absolutely. Yeah.
descriptions and the details, the colors, the shapes.
Yeah. And do you ever go back and visit? Because like I just visited Cleveland, Ohio, which I've been out of for over 35 years now.
Yeah.
I just went back recently and it's like things seem smaller.
Things are very small.
Yeah.
We're
It's really
bigger.
weird. Yeah.
We're bigger than we were when we were 8 years old. But
Yeah.
yes, things seem smaller. The trees are all bigger because they've had another 30 years to grow. So the tree canopies are huge and shady now. I actually haven't, this story, my youth took place in Washington, D.C. and Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington. And I have not actually been back there for, oh God, probably 20 years. I haven't been there very many times even since I moved away, and yet Washington itself is very vivid to me. And especially in the senior year in high school, which is the framing of the book. The book starts with my parents giving me a car, an old used car that they bought because I was going to a private school downtown and I had no way to get there other than driving. So here I am, 16 years old, with this actually kind of clunky, not very cool, but actually big, loud, thrumming engine V8 Studebaker sedan, like racing around Washington, D.C. right at the time when the interstate highways were just being built. The Capitol Beltway, which
Right.
encircles the city, wasn't even completed then. Only like two-thirds of it were there, and uh, I mean, a lot of what I did in my senior year in high school was drive around with my friends, or drive to see my friends, or pick up my friends when we would go out in the country and sit around and drink beer, or we would take walks, or um, but so all that sort of visual stuff is very close to the surface with me. It's the the things that the things that I had to sort of really decide how to remember were more the things that had sort of emotional valence, sort of things about friendships, things about other people's character, um,
Yeah.
which, it's easy to describe a car. It was two-tone blue and it had white wall tires, and, the character of my good friend with whom I drove in that car to Canada. Well, I'm trying to remember. We had this long trip to Canada, and actually we did several long trips together, and I can't remember a single thing we talked about. Did we possibly drive for hours without having a conversation? That's unreal. But what
Yeah.
was it? I don't
Any
remember.
music on the radio back then was
Oh,
probably
music is
AM radio.
also a big
Yeah.
thing, a big piece of it. Actually, I was thinking, uh, because you do so much with music,
Yeah.
um, I was remembering that the year I was a senior in high school was 1964, 65. And I
Yeah.
was thinking about the music of that period and how it was sort of evolving right then. In 64, it seems to me the pop music was dominated by Motown and sort of rather sweet rock and roll, like the Beach Boys, doo-wop, girl groups, Sonny and Cher, sort
Yeah.
of stuff verging on novelty music. Um, By 1965, as I remember it, pop music was sort of hardening in a way, and it was kind of coincident with the sort of emergence of the counterculture and sort of radical politics and a sort of radical stance on the part of kids. I mean, the Stones were much more prominent at the end of that year than at the beginning. And you had other groups like the Animals and the Kinks and the Zombies and the Yardbirds and the Who. Even the names of them are kind of Them was the name of a group. And Bob Dylan goes electric in the same year.
Right, right.
Um, so everything is getting in the music is becoming edgier and harder, harder edged, a little more, a little less tuneful, maybe a little less smooth.
Yeah, it
Uh,
went from that innocent boy band stuff to like even the Beatles went to Rubber Soul and got more deep, and then you
yeah.
really things really
And
changed.
so, that happens to be my senior year of high school, 1964, 65. But I
Wow.
actually think it is a certain moment historically. There was a certain kind of shift going on at that time. So, anyway, I thought your listeners might be interested in that little musical memory.
Oh yeah, it's fascinating the time that you grew up in. It's just completely fascinating part of history, incredibly changing to this day that we're experiencing. Because
Yeah,
when you saw all that stuff, especially Bloody Sunday, and then you went and marched over at the White House right
yeah.
after
Well, I
that.
mean, stuff was happening, like the civil rights movement was going on. Washington was the center of it. Wasn't really the main center of it, but um, even earlier when I was in junior high school, friends and I started going on civil rights picket lines we went to integrate an apartment complex near where we lived that we, to our horror, we discovered was segregated. And we thought, well, this isn't right. This is in our neighborhood. We should like go say do our thing. Um, and when you lived I don't know if this is still true growing up in Washington. Um, the government felt so present. My father worked for the government. A lot of our fathers worked for the government in different capacities. All the like monumental buildings of government, the like department buildings are all there downtown. And if you uh, when you went downtown, you saw it, you felt it, and so it seemed. And also because we were sort of naively had been brought up to think, this is an open democracy and everybody's voice is heard and things. It seemed perfectly natural to like go join a picket line in front of the White House. And these were not confrontational demonstrations. That comes a few years later. They were quite decorous. Um,
Yeah.
Picket lines, people holding signs, but walking in a loop and on the sidewalk. I don't remember police presence even. I mean, there must have been cops keeping an eye on us, but there wasn't fighting, there wasn't confrontation, there wasn't shouting. We were chanting slogans sometimes, and we were singing civil rights songs, which most of which are based on spirituals, actually, with like word changes in them. Um, so it felt very sort of peaceful, and we didn't feel unwelcome to be in places like at the White House or at the Capitol. In the same way that I felt about that apartment complex. I mean, I felt like this is my home. I live here. This is, my dad works over there, and in those days there was security was like sort of non-existent. I mean, if you wanted to go to the Capitol, you just walked in. You could walk in and walk into the Senate and on the balcony and watch it going on. Um, nobody was like stopping you. There were no metal detectors. So, that was a different world for sure. I mean, now I haven't been to Washington lately, but I'm pretty sure you can't even get close to the Capitol unless you have like, you're wearing a
Wow.
badge on your neck and, you go through several layers of questioning and like going to an airport like times 10 probably is what it's like now, I
Oh
imagine.
yeah. Yeah. It's just, especially what's happened over about 4 years ago. It's like, of course,
Yeah.
that security is like
Yeah.
way increased. It's unbelievable. But you
Yeah.
saw those differences between being in Maryland versus Virginia back in those days. And this is just 100 years after the Civil War. I mean, there was
Yeah.
still really very, very, very much Civil War. I'm here in the South here too. There are remnants. It's
Yeah.
changed a lot over these last almost 4 decades now,
Yeah.
but wow.
Well, I mean, this was partly it's quite subjective. We lived in Chevy Chase, Maryland. That was and still is a sort of liberal community. Uh, my idea growing up was that everything on the other side of the Potomac River, which was Virginia, was like sort of scary. Ku Klux Klan and burning bushes, burning crosses, and um, I mean, that's not exactly, it wasn't exactly that stark a difference, but I remember kind of sort of feeling it whenever we drove across the river, that we often used a bridge called Chain Bridge. And in my mind, that it was called Chain Bridge because I believe that they had chain gangs of prisoners working in Virginia. Actually, there were chain gangs in some southern states then,
Oh
or
yeah.
maybe not even then. There were no longer, I checked this out because I didn't want to be inaccurate about it. There were no more chain gangs in Virginia when I was a kid. That had been a practice that had been abandoned. Um, but in my mind, Virginia was like sort of scary redneck territory.
Hmm.
My elementary school was desegregated the year after Brown versus Board of Education. So in second grade, um, there was a poor forlorn black girl was in our class all by herself. I mean, I don't think anybody
Gosh.
talked to her. It was like, but probably not easy for her, but it was normalized. Whereas Virginia and many states in the South were like
Hmm.
kicking and screaming, and Virginia didn't finish integrating its public schools for another 20 years. So, uh, I had this idea that the Confederacy, the Klan, the violence that we knew was happening, uh, for example, in civil rights battles in the South, you could see it, like Bloody Sunday or
Yeah.
the Freedom Rides, where black students were like trying to integrate interstate bus service, and the bus would get firebombed while they were on it. There was really scary things were happening. To me, that all was South. It was all on the other side of the river. And where we lived in Maryland was lovely and liberal and open and forward-looking. And actually, that wasn't true either. There were plenty of segregated situations and plenty of racist examples of things happening in Maryland too. But as a kid, you have a limited view of the world, let's say, and that's how I thought of it at the time.
Yeah. Well, what a change. It's unbelievable. I mean, the times that you grew up and saw all that stuff, especially now were a lot of names changed to protect the innocent in your book? Did you have to or just use
Actually,
first names?
no. I used people's real first names with maybe two or three exceptions because the incidents, the anecdotes I was telling in those cases were something that could really embarrass or hurt somebody's feelings. And it's a person I had not been in touch with in decades. And I don't even know if they're still alive, but um, I discovered that I could just use people's first names. And if the person I called John, who actually somebody I'm in touch with, but let's say I wasn't in touch with him now, if he happened to read the book and saw that he was being described with his first name, well, I'm just giving his first name. John's a pretty common name. That doesn't lead anybody to his email address right away
Right, right.
or
It's
any
important.
other like identifying characteristic. So, and then the funny thing is, I mentioned many people in the course of the book. Uh, there were virtually no duplications of names. You would
Hmm.
think that I would have had like five Andys and 14 Johns, but no, there was, a Frank and a Richard and a lot of well-distributed individual
Sure.
names. How that happened, I don't know, but that's actually it. So I didn't really make up names, no. I mean, that's something when you're writing memoir and you're trying to be honest and accurate about it. It's something I know other writers, people have different strategies about it because uh, you might be telling stories that could hurt somebody's feelings or get someone in trouble, or make someone mad at you, or
Right. Yeah,
uh,
it's true.
so. I mean, I wasn't particularly worried about any of that, but in the just a couple of instances, I thought there's no reason not to give this person a different name because you know why put someone in an uncomfortable position.
Yeah.
I would get nothing from it. The book would nothing would be added to the book by not changing the person's name. So
And your siblings all saw everything before you went to publish, so
no.
everything was no, it's
Uh, I talked to them each a number of times to like check my memory about certain things. Um, and they were helpful and willing to have those conversations, but they only now are I haven't spoken to my sister yet about the book. I know she
Wow.
just got hold of it. I had a good conversation with my younger brother yesterday. My older brother read it a few weeks ago, and he sent me an email and said, "Oh, I love it. It was great." But that's as far as we've gotten. So, and I know he's a very reflective person, and he's very sort of obsessed with his own upbringing too. So I'm sure we'll have a more meaty conversation at some point. What I would really like to do, and this is kind of logistically impossible because we live all over the country, would be getting the four of us in a room together to talk about it, and then selling like fly on the wall tickets to our friends who are really interested in this, so they could like watch us dissect the book and talk about it and correct each other and things. But that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Wish we could all do that. It's just, yeah, one big old therapy session, everybody
Yeah.
just getting it all out on the table. It's just like, yeah, it's just fascinating to go through the book and to see how you're just, growing and your perspective and everything. And then going back to your parents and the kind of relationships that you had. And you were like one of those very early free range kids. They talk about free range kids. I kind of was back in the 70s. But
Yeah.
here you were in the 60s. Really honestly, I mean, kids today, obviously, we look at this and like they wouldn't have nearly this amount of freedom or
Oh, I
experiences.
mean, it's really it's sort of amazing. In a way, I feel hugely privileged now that I've like really thought about how much freedom I had. I mean, I had the car. Um, my mother was dying. My father was quite checked out. So nobody, I came and went. I might say I'll be home Tuesday, or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I mean, that was sort of exceptional because of what was happening with my mother dying and my father being like having my father was already in love with someone else that he was planning to marry, and in his defense, I'm sure he was exhausted after this like long illness of my mother's that went on for years. But he was so checked out that I never had a single conversation with him about where I would go to college. I just told him
Mm.
where I was going to college. And actually, a few years later, when I dropped out of college, I called him up and I said, "Daddy, I'm dropping out of college." He said, "Okay."
Yeah.
End the conversation. So, I mean, his mind was on some other stuff, not on me, which, I probably could have used a little more support and attention. I might have been a little less erratic and I might have made some fewer mistakes in my life around that time if I had someone giving me more guidance. But on the other hand, I was, it's sort of amazing to have this kind of freedom and also uh, the sort of the way the world was just there, and it wasn't just what I had. It was the resource living in a place like Chevy Chase, which is a very leafy, comfortable, beautiful suburb, 20 minutes from the National Gallery of Art, and all kinds of resources and sort of interesting cultural things that, I mean, Washington was a much more provincial town in the 60s than it is now, but still it was quite a civilized, worldly place, with people from all over the world. I mean, so it was, you could sort of come and go and create your own educational experience every day. It was kind of great.
Yeah, and some of the schools you mentioned that are in here, like Hawthorne and your junior high, Western Junior High. God, what a time! In junior high, it's like the worst.
Yeah,
You're
the
all
worst.
taking showers together. I'm like, that is, and going through that experience, I think it's traumatic no matter what. Like
Well,
the
I think
things
it's
they
it's
made you
traumatic
do.
to be an adolescent. It's traumatic to
Just
be going through puberty. And when you're doing it in a school of 2,000 kids, and when I entered that school in seventh grade, I was 11, and there were kids up to 15, and I was like, I had not gone through puberty yet, so like, I was a little boy, and there were like these, like kids, and um, just speaking of the boys, I mean, it's not easy to grow up as a boy and become a young man because you have the society is expecting things of you. It's giving you certain like rules you're not supposed to break. And in those days, the particular tension with me was that I was trying to fight the fact that I'm gay, and I successfully fought it for quite a long time. Um, I don't think, in essence, that the insecurity would be that much different for a gay kid or a straight kid because all, every boy has to somehow get a handle on what it means to become a sexual person and become a man. Um, And there's a lot of expectations from the culture about what that means, how you're supposed to act, what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to treat girls, how you're supposed to treat other guys. Um, and if you deviate from that, or if you're uncomfortable with those things, regardless of what your own sexual orientation is, um, it's scary. And you can make mistakes and you can get in trouble, and people can pick on you for making mistakes. Uh, I describe in the book some, we can let people read these, but I describe
Sure.
several experiences when in the course of trying to fight being gay, I was having sexual relationships with girls. I mean, at the age of 16 and 17. And uh, I describe, I think as honestly as I can, that these must have been like pretty unpleasant for the girls because I was like completely not interested in them. I was like doing this as like a notch on my belt. See, I'm not gay
Yeah.
because I can have sex with girls. Um, and it must have been pretty unpleasant for them, or at least not very pleasant. It was kind of unpleasant for me too, because I was forcing myself to do it. But I don't think that's that different from what a lot of straight boys do at the same ages of 16 and 17. You force yourself to do this stuff because you think in order to prove yourself, you're supposed to do it.
Right.
And I mean, I know that I had friends who were in like serious, like in love with each other relationships, couples, boys and girls, a couple of them, that was pretty precocious of them at the age of 17. But, I'm not saying that those weren't real, but I think most kids who were dating or going steady or whatever, it was really, a lot of it was surely was kind of forced because people felt this is what they were supposed to do. So, yeah, I don't know how different it is now to be a teenager. I mean, I do think it's probably less terrifying to be a gay teenager because you have more open examples. You have openly gay teachers, whereas I
Yep.
had a couple of teachers who I'm pretty sure were gay. Sometimes some of them we knew were gay, some of them we suspected were gay. Couldn't be open. So like we couldn't
Mm.
have a conversation with them about it, and they couldn't model a confident, open way of being who they were. I mean, now that's different, and I think, of course, it, it's not thorough across the entire culture, but in many parts of the culture, there's just much more openness. Many families are more open. It's less of a fight for kids, which I don't think makes it easier to grow up gay, but I don't think it's easy to grow up male, actually. Period.
It's all very true. Yeah, that really is. It's just, thankfully, yeah, there's a lot more awareness. There's a lot more awareness and just general bullying. The
Yeah.
derogatory terms were always there. I was in the 80s in junior high school, and it was terrible. Even
Yeah.
then, my God, I mean, and the way that people would pick on you, especially
Yeah.
as a boy. Now girls are just mean. I think they play more psychological games than boys
But
do.
it's a form of bullying too, really. I
Yeah.
mean, it can be. And yeah, I mean, I consider that I was fag baited, but not exactly bullied. I mean, I was never like physically beaten up or anything. I was intimidated and I was made fun of. And I wasn't, somehow they weren't that interested in me. The bullies, like they had other people who were like better victims than I was, which is
Right.
to say I'm sorry to the victims for no noticing that about them. But, I guess I had some degree of self-confidence so that I didn't let myself get too destroyed by it. But
Yeah.
a lot of it wasn't fun. And just, I mean, this probably hasn't changed either. I mean, being in one of 2,000 students in a school, like how alienating is that? It's,
Oh gosh, it's so huge. Yeah, my daughter went to high school. I think there was close to
oh
5,000.
my God.
Gosh, like I go to school with 5,000 savages. She would say it's like
Yeah.
it's so true, and you
Yeah.
feel yeah, you're a real number.
Well, and then in 11th grade, I transferred to this private school that was downtown that was 200 people in four grades, ninth through 12th. So like in my senior class, there were 48 students.
Mm.
Um, and that was a completely different experience in a lot of ways. First of all, just because it was smaller, it was intimate, you were known. You sort of knew everybody. Everybody knew you. The teachers, even the teachers who weren't you weren't in their classes, they still knew who you were. And it was a rather it was a pretty rigorous place academically, actually. It was challenging and which I appreciate. But it was also very kind of informal. We called the teachers by their first names, for example. Uh,
Wow.
we often we would go when I was a senior, there was the history teacher was someone who my friends and I would like on Friday afternoon go buy beer and go sit in the park and drink with him. That's pretty unusual now. I guess you wouldn't do that in a public school anyway. Um, but that school, had a lot of character. It had a lot of characters. The teachers were all, they all were sort of quirky, interesting people who maybe wouldn't have made it teaching in public school. They couldn't have like constrained themselves. And so just as it was for us, the students, it was easier for them to just be who they were, and be like weirdos. And uh, so that was great. And I was unhappy early in junior high school. By the time I got to Hawthorne School in 11th grade, I was pretty happy. I really liked being there. And
Yeah,
good
what a
friends there
difference. What a
and a
difference.
lot of
And
fun.
then just going through, you skipped a grade because you were in Taipei, Taiwan. So
Yeah.
somehow and that to me it was very unusual to skip somebody. I don't know if I ever knew
It was
anybody.
less unusual then. My dad was in the Foreign Service and we lived in Taiwan when I was 9, 10, 11. So I was like, I was in fourth grade when we got there. Um, at the end of fourth grade, the teacher and the principal, I don't really remember how this came about, but it was decided that I would skip fifth grade and go right into sixth grade. And that wasn't that uncommon then. I guess, my grades were really good. Maybe I was, I mean, I don't think the American school that we went to in Taiwan probably was not a very challenging school. So I might have been used to a sort of more rigorous academics. So I probably did really well in fourth grade, and that's why. So that was fine. And then I was there for sixth grade, and that was fine. And then we came back to Washington, and suddenly I was in seventh grade. The kids I had been in elementary school in the like sweet little red brick school around the corner since kindergarten were still in sixth grade, and I was in
Yeah.
seventh grade in the giant 2,000 student school, and the kind of school where you went to six different classes every day, and I didn't know a soul, and I was the youngest person probably, or one of the very youngest people in the school, and that was like a really really scary experience. That like seventh grade was kind of nightmare time for me, um, because of that. And I it took me a long actually it took me until writing this book, which is now what 60 years later, um, to actually examine that matter of having skipped fifth grade and realizing that maybe that really was not the best thing for me to have done. I mean, uh, I probably would have had a much less unpleasant experience of seventh grade if I had come back home to Washington and rejoined my cohort in sixth grade at the neighborhood school. And all together, we had gone on to the big junior high school. So I wouldn't have been completely alone there. I wouldn't have known the other 1,960 kids, but I would have known the 40 that I came from Somerset School with. Um, so I'm not sure that was a great idea to skip the grade. And you don't really hear about it happening anymore. Maybe educators have realized it's a fraught thing to do. It's not necessarily a great thing to do to kids. It makes you feel you're weird. Suddenly you're the youngest person. It makes in addition to all the other reasons to feel uncomfortable about being in junior high school, that's one more thing that maybe could be avoided if people didn't skip grades. So
Yeah, if anything, they hold kids back now, so the
yeah,
kid has more of an advantage. That's been more of the trend over all these years.
well, I wonder if that causes other kinds of problems for kids who then they're like the oldest kid in their class, and
Right.
I don't know. It doesn't bear dwelling on. Um, but so yeah, that's actually an example of a way of thinking about myself was transformed in the course of writing the book because I had never sort of questioned I skipped fifth grade. I was because I was smart. That's the way I just always have thought about it. But in reflecting back on my teenage years, I realized the impact it had on me. Maybe it wasn't so good.
Yeah. And so you've had obviously this interest in writing growing up and everything. Is it something that you pretty much just fell into? Sounds like you just had this love of books, reading in this Victorian house and a nice little
Yeah, well,
cubby.
I've always loved reading, and I've always been a big reader. And I, I didn't think I wasn't thinking of becoming a writer until like much later. But uh, I liked reading. I liked writing assignments and research papers and things like that. And when I got involved in the anti-war movement, uh, later, like when I was, 20, 21, when I had dropped out of college, this is like 67, 68. One of the things did was some of the writing, like when we would write leaflets or articles for radical newspapers or something. I did a lot of the writing, and I liked it. And became an editor of one of those leftist student newspapers. I mean, I really had never like studied anything about like what does it mean to be an editor? What do you actually do? I just had, somebody else left and it needed to be done, and I just did it. And um, so that's where I first started sort of being a writer. And at a certain point, I realized, I had always thought, oh, I'm going to do something in the arts, maybe something in theater. I might maybe like set design or lighting design or something like that. Um, and then at a certain point, I guess when I was in my early 20s, like I said, wait, I'm already doing this thing. I already know how to write. I already like writing. Writing is a thing I can do. And so that's what I did. And I've had a long career as a journalist and magazine editor. I've written all kinds of things. The through line of my interest has been architecture, urban design, and sort of the intersection of built and natural environments. So I've written a lot about those kinds of things. Everything from sort of interior design and visual arts, residential design, park planning, parks and conservation areas, and sort of the whole thing about the built environment. But I've also, for years, I did a lot of travel writing. I was a restaurant critic. I've written profiles of people. I've had a lot of fun with it, actually. And I'm fortunate to have gone into journalism at a time when, as a freelancer, you could actually make a living. That's changed. I mean, I guess people somehow manage, but I'm not sure how they do, because in 2008, when the big financial crash happened and magazines started going out of business like crazy because there was no
Yeah.
advertising money. At the same time, publishing was moving online, and so the business model was really changing. And I found that uh, the same article that I might have written a year earlier for a print magazine for a $2,000 fee, I was being
Hmm.
offered $200 to do this, or $50 to do the same thing. Well, I mean, I couldn't really do that. Um,
Yeah.
and So, that was sort of a rude awakening. But
Yeah.
actually, fortunately, right around that time, I had been hired to be an editor of a magazine. So I actually had a staff job, which made a difference. And then for the last, God, I guess 15 years, I've been a contributing editor to Landscape Architecture magazine, which is uh, it's a freelance position. I'm not really on staff, but quite unusually, this magazine, because it is the publication of the American Society of Landscape Architects. And so if you're a landscape architect and you pay dues to belong, and part of your dues helps support the magazine. It also has lots of advertising, but it manages to pay writers as if it's still 2007. Like
Hmm.
their fee structure didn't change. So, and that's quite unusual these days. So I'm really fortunate. I mean, when young people often say to me, "Oh, I'd like to become a writer. I'd like to become a magazine writer. What should I do? And how can I do that?" And my first question to them is, "Do you have a trust fund?"
Exactly. I know
Because
it's changed.
it's really hard. I don't know how
Oh,
people do it, but
I love doing it. I dabbled in it on the side. I'm in TV production as
yeah.
my day job, and I did a lot of freelance stuff on my own. And yeah, it's really dried up. I love doing it. and
Yeah,
having that freedom and everything. But yeah, everything changed. Media
yeah,
has really changed now. TV, streaming, all that's just very complicated now.
yeah, yeah. So I'm lucky I like aged out of that all that. And now
Yeah.
I work very hard now, really. I'm kind of retired or semi-retired or
Yeah, and doing very good at your age. Absolutely. Doing very well. There's probably many more chapters to write. Where are you based out of now?
I live in upstate New York in a town called Hudson. It's about
Okay.
120 miles up the Hudson River from New York City.
Okay. I had
Beautiful
somebody.
little
Yeah.
small historic city in a gorgeous countryside. I can look across the river and see the Catskill Mountains 20
Oh,
minutes away and great hiking, great local food. It's a nice place to live.
is that where David Bowie was in his later years? Was up in that area? I know.
Somewhere around here, there's a lot of media people and theater and music people who've moved up here, and a lot of um, like writers, editors, advertising people. Um, a big sort of constant influx of people coming up from New York City, retiring or um, getting like country houses here for a week as to use as weekend houses. It's close enough that you can do that. The really rich people do look toward the Hamptons out at the end of Long
Yeah.
Island. The less rich people who have only enough money for a small country house look up in this direction. Um, and so there's a lot of very interesting people here and sort of great cultural life actually. And the Hudson where I live is a tiny little city, but it really is a city. It was planned in the 18th century with this little urban grid. It has alleys between the streets, and so all the houses are very close together. And I live right in the middle of it, and I can walk to sort of everything: cultural events, the drugstore, the post office, the library. It's all right here within a few blocks. So
Yeah.
that's kind of nice, especially getting to the point where I don't want to drive that much. I want to drive it.
I've been in the Atlanta area for decades now, and it's like I'm so over this. It's like
Yeah,
one day
yeah,
I just like to just get away from that and
yeah.
just.
I lived in Atlanta for a long time. I think when we
Yeah.
first connected, I was still living there.
Oh, were you okay?
Um,
Wow.
but I've been
Yeah.
gone there since 2010, I think.
2010. So yeah, through the years, what's become very big, and it's happening everywhere. My
Yeah,
daughter actually lives in a place like this, and you who appreciates architecture could really
yeah.
understand this. The type of like townhouses and
Uh-huh.
apartments that are going up look like prisons. I hate to say it, but I know this is more functional for Gen Z, maybe even some millennials and beyond. But
Well, I know for older people too, because you can start walking places. You don't have to be able to drive. Um, yeah, I mean, there's there's urban densification, and that is one thing, and how it's designed is another thing. Like some of those
mm,
new buildings are like pretty boring. They look like they were like stamped out in a factory. But I'm all for the idea of like mixed use buildings and smaller lots and close things being closer together and better public transportation and people not
yeah.
having to rely on cars as much. I think all that's the wave of the future.
I hope so. I hope so for Atlanta. This is just a nightmare. And I know the greater New York area, like it's a mess too. But like, gosh, cars everywhere. Everywhere you gotta go. Gotta
Yeah,
jump in the car. Just yeah, very, very, very sad. I hope that changes as the new generations
let's hope
take
so.
over. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Well, great book, Performance Anxiety, titled for those very obvious reasons from being in your adolescence. I love the cover. Did you have
I
somebody
had nothing to
specially?
do with it. The publisher has a designer who did it, and I'm thrilled with it. It does capture that whole kind of like slightly wild. For people who haven't seen it, it's just like a picture of a car and a city in the background, and it's kind of cartoony. I mean, it looks like everything's about to explode. I don't know. I was very happy with it, I have to say.
Excellent. Are you going to go on a tour promoting this and do these kind of
Well,
talks?
there's no budget for that, so
It's all on your own.
what I'm trying to do is like work through what I can do right here from my computer. People, publicizing it to people who blog about books and have podcasts and
Yeah.
in online. There's a whole online ecosystem of readers and book influencers, and that's the cheap and dirty way to get something
Yeah.
published these days. I'm doing some readings and events right around here that I don't have to like travel for because like if I set something up in New York City, it means I have to go to the city, which I either have to drive for 2 hours to take the train, I have to find a place to stay, I have to eat dinner.
Right.
By the time it's done, I've spent $500 to sell 5 books. So, um,
Easier to get to Atlanta, do the JCC circuit, come over to Dunwoody, and you can talk
yeah,
about it at the book fest.
yeah, that's a thought.
It's a lot easier.
Well, thanks a lot, Bob. This has been great fun.
Yeah, very much, very much. And thanks for connecting with me. We've been connected on the socials for years now, and just really happy that I got to speak with you today.
Yeah, me too. Great.
Take care. Have a good one.
Okay, you too.
Bye. Wow. I really had a great time talking with him because there's just so many things in life where it's difficult to talk about these things so many years out. And, it does kind of like write the script for you and kind of, forms your self-esteem and your identity and all those things. As much as you say that you've moved on from those very tough years, it's really difficult. I think we always deal with that, with the angst and everything that had gotten into our lives when we were far younger. It takes a lot of strength to carry on. And you get that in this book. I really highly recommend it. Get it wherever you get those books. Get it online. Probably better as a hard copy. Still like the old fashioned books where you just, it's kind of nice. And then it looks great on the shelf. Didn't his background for those who are watching on YouTube? Great background. He's got a great office with many books. Anyway, I will see you or hear from you soon. Take care.